back. I'd like to introduce Emily Hartz, who has a PhD in philosophy of law and is doing a master's in psychology to become a clinical psychologist. And she'll be talking to us about shame and boredom.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I'll talk about shame and boredom and a project where I did existential group therapy with residents in a nursing home. But I would like, before diving into that project, to share a personal experience. I had an uncle, Uncle Viggo, who I loved, still love dearly. He died 8 years ago. And towards the end of his life, I visited him in a nursing home. And he was particularly energetic that day. So I said, Viggo, you're looking great today. And he said, I wish beautiful women like yourself had told me so when I actually did look great. And sort of reflecting on that experience, I have come to think that with our good intentions, we often convey shame or feelings of shame on elderly, even those that we love most dearly. So I think that it's important that we think about shame in relation to the nursing home setting. Okay, so what I'll talk about is, first of all, this existential group therapy, which we call the Monday Club. It was on Monday, so it was easy to remember. So I'll give you the sort of framework of what we were doing. Then, in order to understand what passed in those sessions, I found that it was difficult to find appropriate resources to actually understand what was going on. And in the end, I stumbled on Simone de Beauvoir's fantastic book on old age. So I want to just give you a brief sense of the work she does in that book, so that we can use that in order to interpret what passed in the Monday Club. Then I'll talk about nursing home experiences of silence, and I've put shame in brackets. I'll explain why later, and boredom. And then finally, I want to reflect upon, and hopefully together with you, reflect upon how can you work therapeutically with shame and boredom in this group of people. So we'll look at some transcribed, we'll look at what actually took place. Now, the Monday Club was an existentially based group therapeutic intervention targeting socially isolated elderly. Socially isolated elderly was in this context defined as those residents in the nursing home who didn't participate in events. They didn't come out for Wednesday coffees, or they didn't join the morning singing club and so on, who didn't have a lot of visitors, who didn't talk much with any of the other residents, and who were perceived as lonely by the staff. There were 6 participants. They were all residents at Slottet, the castle, which is a nursing home in Nørrebro. Their age ranged from 75 to 96. 2 participants suffered from schizophrenia, 1 from dementia. And I'm flagging this because I want to be transparent about sort of my method. Maybe some of the observations are also observations about how to work with people who suffer from schizophrenia. It's difficult to find 6 socially isolated elderly nursing home residents who does not also have some other kinds of complications in their lives. So that makes the sort of data more complex. None of the participants knew each other beforehand, and we had planned 10 sessions, but because of COVID, we only had 5. And finally, the work of recruiting people for this group turned out to be quite heavy. Most of the residents that I talked to didn't want to participate. And in the end, I had 1 to 3 talks with all in all 16 different residents. So some of the data also comes out of the talks, these recruitment talks. Okay. I expected going in to work on classic existential issues such as death, loss, anxiety, and loneliness. And we ended up, to my own surprise, working in very subtle ways with shame and boredom. So like many of the talks that have been presented, this was not originally a project on shame at all. It sort of seeped out of the material and turned out to be sort of the lens through which I could begin to understand what was going on. And in order to find a resource that could help me come to grips with old age and shame, I turned to Simone de Beauvoir. I do not speak French. I won't try to pronounce the name of the book in French, but in the English translation is called The Coming of Age. And it's, I find, a really wonderful book which links old age with shame, arguing that society looks at old age as a kind of shameful secret that it is unseemly to mention. And she then explicitly sets out to break the conspiracy of silence. So that's kind of the framework for the whole work. And then she investigates old age. I think it's 600 pages through the lens of anthropology, literature, biology, sociology, and finally existential phenomenology. And I really recommend this work. I think it's a fantastic work on shame and on old age. So her engagement with old age is political. The age, she says, do not form a body with any economic strength whatsoever, and they have no possible way of enforcing their rights. It is to the interest of the exploiting class to destroy the solidarity between the workers and the unproductive old, so that there is no one at all to protect them. The myths and cliches put out by bourgeois thought aim at holding up the elderly man as someone who is different, as another. So her work is clearly and explicitly political. At the same time, it is clearly and explicitly existential. We must stop betraying ourselves, she says. The whole meaning of our lives is in question in the future that is waiting for us. If we do not know what we are going to be, we cannot know what we are. Let us recognize ourselves in this old man or in this old woman. So I'll be very brief with Simone de Beauvoir. I'm not at all an expert on her, but I really think that a few quotes from her work is helpful in this setting, because she really has thought, I think, deeply about shame in the context of old age. So she explains the complex truth of old age thus. For the outsider, it is a dialectic relationship between my being as he defines it objectively and the awareness of myself that I require by means of him. Within me, it is the other, that is to say, the person I am for the outsider, that is old. And that other is myself. And she even goes on to explain how she shuddered when she overheard a student tell a fellow student, "Oh, I didn't realize Beauvoir was so old." So it seems that this complex truth of old age at least mirrors the structure of shame explicated by Sartre. Interestingly, and I don't know why, she does not use the word shame here. As I said, I don't read French, but my neighbor does, and she's been very kind to read like 15 pages before and after this quote to see, does she use the word shame? And apparently she doesn't. But there's this same structure of a this shudder and this real acceptance of a truth about me, which I do not own, which comes to me through the gaze of the other. So since it is the other within us who is old, it is natural that the revelation of our age should come to us from outside, from others. We do not accept it willingly. And interestingly, the two gerontologists who read the paper that I wrote about this project, they didn't like Simone de Beauvoir's work at all. They objected strongly to me interpreting what was going on in terms of shame, and they thought it was very inappropriate to kind of project shame onto these elderly residents in a nursing home, as long as they did not themselves address what they were experiencing as shame. And maybe there's something right in that. Maybe that's why Simone de Beauvoir doesn't use the word shame. But on the other hand, I think that if nursing home residents are subject to complicated experiences of shame, it's at least, even if it's only a possibility, it's important to be aware that that might be a feeling that you could undergo in that setting. So boredom also came up in this project, and is also one of the central existential structures that Simone de Beauvoir points out are part of old age. She writes, the old man is bored because either circumstances or his own indifference have detached him from his projects, and because his curiosity has entirely died away. We have seen how in institutions and even outside them, a horrifying gulf can open, and how boredom can become so deep that it does away with all possibility and even all desire to escape from it. In this connection, she talks about old age in terms of the double finality of old age. So the point she makes is that when our future possibility shrinks, either because there is less time, maybe we have less abilities, maybe we can't drive a car anymore, maybe we don't work anymore, maybe our bodily abilities are failing. So when the future possibility shrinks, the potentialities in the moment becomes also more one-dimensional. There's just lesser possibilities that this present moment can sort of project into. And she argues that not only the future shrinks, but then our past shrinks as well. She is very opposed to this romantic idea of old age being time where we happily revisit all our lovely memories from the past. And her own experience is that those memories, they are not as accessible anymore. They are flattened and become more one-dimensional. It seems that the richness in those memories was very much the potentiality that was there as we experienced them. So when I first looked at what turned out to be the future father of my kids, for instance, that the potentiality in that moment has either played itself out or it just never went anywhere. And now I'm 83 and it's apparent that he's probably dead by now. So as our future shrinks, Simone de Beauvoir argues, our past shrinks as well. And we are losing the now in the sense that we're losing both the future and the past at the same time. She says, the passing moments took my breath away when I thought I saw eternity in it. It could never be wiped out. Since I've come to see that my future has an end, moments are no longer eternal. They no longer give me the absolute. They will fully vanish, or else they will fall into ashes that my grave will swallow together with my person. So the moment, the now, is boring in the sense that it it doesn't have the same potentiality that it had before. It doesn't project into the past and the future. It is somehow sapped of meaning. It is pure time in a sense. So now with those notions of shame and boredom, I want to start to try to make sense of my experiences in this nursing home setting. Before doing so, I want to show you some pictures of the castle, because I think it's important in order to understand my experiences there to acknowledge that the castle doesn't look like a boring place. It's this beautiful old building. It's in the middle of a vibrant area of Copenhagen. Nørrebro, there are these flower and vegetable beds where families from the neighborhood come and plant stuff. Behind those bushes, there are goats that kids can play with, and this greenhouse. They have always free tea and coffee, so you can, like, if you live in the area, you can bring your kids. So it's a very lively space there. It's not a hospitalized, dreary nursing home setting where everyone would walk in the door and immediately be bored. Also, the apartments are spacious. You can bring your own furniture. The staff there are very helpful and very attuned to, like, try to make meaningful lives for the residents. And to add to that, it's also the only LGBT nursing home in Denmark. So this is from some years ago, from the nursing home's contribution to the Pride Parade. That being said, there are very few residents who self-identify as LGBT. Probably that will change, but with that generation, it's unusual, but there are some, and it's a very open space and not in and by itself a boring place. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay, so what were then my experiences of silence? I've put shame in brackets and boredom in this castle. First, there was this prevailing silence, and that's my experience here. It's also my experience in another nursing home where I also did some work. And this silence is very loud. When you have a lot of people in a room and there's this massive silence, it's really something that you notice. And if there wasn't a loud TV or an event where some staff was making noise of some kind, the most strongly thing that you notice is this prevailing silence. And one of the residents articulated this silence. He said, "No, but here no one says anything during meals. They just say hello. And then what is there to say? Then someone sits like this and he bangs loudly and continuously on the walker. And then they shout, 'Stop!' And that's really all that happens." So the residents themselves also noticed this silence. In addition to silence, I noticed this thing that the residents made a lot of effort at distancing themselves from the other residents. So they tended to describe the other residents as older, weaker, or more cognitively disabled than themselves. And only one of them I spoke with, self-identified as old. She was 96. So they all felt, they wouldn't say that in the group setting, but when I talked with them in the recruitment talks one-on-one, they all felt somewhat sort of misplaced or displaced. And they didn't self-identify as old, but were very, made a point of distancing themselves from the other residents. With the two comments from the two gerontologists in mind, I think that we should, of course, be cautious to identify this silence and this tendency not to self-identify as old as shame, because it can be so many things and we don't really know. But I think it's important to be aware that shame might be at play, and that making environments where residents can relate to each other in ways that don't invite these stereotyped, this stereotyped gaze of the other as old could probably be helpful. So that's why I put shame in brackets. Boredom. I think I didn't expect boredom to be a theme either when I started this project. So it was only after a while that I became aware that during the recruitment talks, all but one participant spontaneously brought up this theme during the recruitment talks. And these are some of the quotes. Time drags along. The other residents are boring and have nothing to offer. And the one that hit me the most, because this was a previous social worker who was deep into existential psychology, and there was Yalom and Rollo May and Heidegger and Beauvoir, all my books on her shelf, and she just gestured to them and said, even my books bore me now. So this sense of boredom was really a pervading thing, and that from the two gerontologists, they agree that that is something that is very articulate in many nursing home settings, this deep sense of boredom. Yeah. I will argue that shame and boredom, using Radcliffe's notion, are existential feelings. So they are variants of a non-localized felt sense of reality and belonging, something that all intentionally directed experiences and thoughts presuppose. So there's there are these generalized feelings. So in contrast to more specifically directed feelings, for instance, of joy or anger, the experience of shame or boredom is dispersed in an all-encompassive negative coloring of our relationship to ourselves and the environment. Thus, what we immediately experience when we feel ashamed or bored is not the feeling of shame and boredom in itself, but primarily ourselves and our relationship to the world in a shameful or bored light. So I think these feelings, if they are pervading feelings in a nursing home setting, are difficult to get at, because it's not this or that thing that bores me or makes me ashamed. It's rather sort of the whole relation to oneself and the world. In shame and boredom, we become agonizingly aware of ourselves. As one resident explained, I'm afraid that the other participants in the Monday Club will bore me, and I would find that embarrassing for them as well as for myself. So this was her reason not to participate in the Monday Club. And I think she articulated what others were probably too polite to articulate: the fact that that it would just be boring to participate in this setting. Okay, so how do we work therapeutically with shame and boredom with elderly nursing home residents? These are, I think that we've seen through some of the talks how it can be healing and helpful to talk through experiences that has evoked shame and boredom, not boredom, but shame. And I think that can be helpful in some settings. Here, where we don't even have an articulated or even conscious experience of shame, but it's rather a work of trying to relate to the world as other and more than this stereotyped old person, or even just being the work of just being this old person and living the shame of that, whatever that means. Here it has to be more subtle And I think it's difficult because shame and boredom are also shameful feelings. So how do we even begin to sort of work therapeutically with that? The therapeutic work with shame and boredom in the Monday Club is focused on facilitating contact between participants in a way that allows them to experience seeing and being seen as the complex people they are, rather than the stereotypical nursing home residents they tend to see each other as. And I think that's really important, that they do see each other as these stereotyped nursing home residents. And they rarely speak with each other. There's this romantic idea that we move into a nursing home and we can, meet equals and have lovely conversations. But in reality, there is mostly just this silence. And to that point, some of the participants in the group, they actually lived on the same corridor and had meals together for months, but never ever talked to each other or even noticed each other or even knew what the name of the other was. So an important element of this work is that the content of the therapeutic conversations comes from the participants themselves, so that they do not end up talking about an externally defined theme, but instead talk themselves forth as they talk. So that, I think, is the work, not to bring shame on the table, let's now talk about shame, but try to find a way to be vulnerable together with other residents. To this end, my questions are deliberately as empty as possible. And if possible, I simply repeat what the participants themselves say. Other times I fail to say anything at all. And therefore there are often extended periods of silence. So now let's look at how that might look. This is from the very first session. The names are, what you call it, synonyms? Synonyms? What? Pseudonyms, thanks. Sonia, Erna, Bjarne, Ruth, Inga, and Leila are present. And I ask Sonia, will you tell us a little about yourself? There isn't much. Okay. There isn't anything. So this is a typical conversation you would have with these socially isolated nursing home residents. Later in the session, I ask again, and Sonia says that she's from Lolland, a Danish island. Where do you feel at home? On Lolland, in Copenhagen, or in Copenhagen? On Amager, which is where we are now. And I say, on Amager, tell us about Amager. And then there is silence for 10 seconds. That might not seem as a lot of time, but let's just experience 10 seconds together. So. 10 seconds is a long time when you're used to doing the work of conversation, which is bringing it forth, asking interesting questions. So you're sitting there with 6 people and there's just silence. So what comes out of these 10 seconds of silence is that Sonia then says, I lack something to hold between my hands. And I say, you lack something to hold between your hands. And that, I think, is the discipline here, is not to immediately start to interpret, but just to stay with what she brings to the table. Yes. And then I go, shall I see if I can find anything? But what could that be? Then I clumsily find this Easter bunny that has been forgotten in a corner, and I go, this is a rabbit. I don't think it has been held for a long time. I believe it has laid in the corner since Easter, and I give this Easter bunny to Sonia. And she says, no, but I meant something like knitting or crochet work. And I think this extremely clumsy attempt I mean, it shows how diffuse and unclear this lack she's trying to express is. I really have a hard time understanding it. And then I give her something, and this something makes her at least able to differentiate her lack from what it clearly is not. It's not a longing or a lack of holding an Easter bunny. And she goes, I meant something like knitting or crochet work. Then I bring that lack of knitting and crochet work to the group. Do any of you others knit or crochet? And again, there's no response. And it might sound easy to be in this no response silence. I mean, it's logically, it's not difficult to sit there in silence, but it feels in the setting almost as physical work. So it's enduring this embarrassment of the non-existing conversation, and somehow this urge in oneself to either, you know, take over the conversation or run out of the room. And you can, for me, it's also a physical feeling of unease. So it's really this this work of conversation is also for me a very physical and bodily work of just, you know, staying with the no, or staying in this non-response. And I think there is a sense in which that in existential therapy, sort of it's articulated as very important to tend to the here and now in the therapeutic situation. And with these residents who really generally are overwhelmed by this pervading feeling of boredom and this stereotyped view of themselves and others as old, I think that tending to the here and now in the therapeutic situation is sort of accepting the potential and devastating meaningless of this here and now. So I ask one participant directly, Bjarne, what do you say? No. And I do the hard work of staying with that no. So Bjarne does not knit. And then Erna says something. I think this is the first time someone spontaneously says something. And she says, I have knitted. So this quoted conversation may seem like a very limited, very controlled, and not very lively interaction. However, compared to the total silence of spontaneous interaction that is normal for these residents, this conversation represents, I would argue, a radical change, because the interaction takes place between the residents. So she is actually relating to this lack that Sonja first describes. From being a diffuse and entirely private experience of lacking something in her hands, Sonja's lack has been articulated as the lack of knitting. I then use Sonja's formulation in my conversation with Erna, and thus it is Sonja's experience of having something in her hands that becomes the starting point for Erna's exploration of what knitting means to her. This lack can now be understood into a common theme around knitting, which is very different than it would have been if I had introduced knitting like as a theme into which we could speak. Erna says, I have knitted, me. I bring then Sonja's phrase to sort of facilitate it as an interaction. Do you know the feeling of lacking something to hold between your hands? Yes, she says. Do you still knit? Absolutely. Are you knitting something at the moment? And then again, no. And I really think that our gut reaction to this no is, oh, come on, I'll bring some knitting yarn. It will be fun. And you can knit something for the table that we will set for Easter or whatever. I mean, this no is really not a nice place to be. So I think our gut feeling is to run away from it and also like try to rescue nursing home residents from it. And I think that a lot of it was very helpful to just try to stay with this no. So I say no. And then she says, because I need someone to knit to make something for someone. I do not want to just knit out in the blue. So there is so much there if you sort of have the guts to stay with that no. And up until now, none of the participants have addressed each other. If they say anything, they say it to me. But suddenly, Sonja directly addresses Erna and says, do you use knitting recipes? And she says, yes, I do. And again, this might not seem as much, but these are people who live next to each other, who don't know each other's name, and who don't expect the others to be at a cognitive level where it's worthwhile to have a conversation with each other. So I actually think this little interaction here is quite significant. So Erna relates to the theme of knitting by articulating the absence of someone to knit for. Our joint exploration of why she does not knit leads her to articulate this relational aspect in different ways. For example, I think that for knitting to be nice, you always have to have that person in mind. It is at this point that Sonja suddenly addresses Erna directly. It can be argued that the facilitated interaction helps to establish the contours of a shared world between Sonja and Erna. For both, it's true that they relate to the absence of knitting on an existential level. For Sonja, it is an expression of a more or less vague or diffuse lack. And for Erna, it is an expression of the absence of someone to knit for. Thus, knitting is not just an incidental theme, it is experienced by both as something that concerns them, which may or may not be the reason that Sonja suddenly for the first time spontaneously addresses someone else. Now, I turn to Bjarne. How is it for you to sit here and listen to talk about knitting recipes? Well, I don't really know, and there's no emotional response. It has to be said that when our muscles, they get old, then we get weaker in our bodies, and that also goes for the face. So one thing that is puzzling in conversations with very old people is that it really takes an effort to smile or to even have the slightest emotional expression. So a lot of the time there is just no emotional response. You don't know? No. So again, this no. And here I am able to endure it for 20 seconds, but then I just can't endure it anymore. So I ask, do you know the feeling of making something for someone? So I'm trying now to use Erna's phrase and see if that can somehow resonate with Bjarne. Making something for someone. Erna talked of making something for someone. Well, I guess that could be nice, maybe. Yes. But I do not know who I should knit something for. That is actually the same as Erna just. And then this amazing thing happens. Bjarne actually interrupts me and he says, I have an older brother, so I could knit a sweater for him. And then there's this hint of a smile in the corner of Bjarne's mouth. The idea of knitting a sweater for his brother is apparently so surprising to Bjarne that he gets this hint of a smile on the corner of his mouth at the thought, which is the first time Bjarne expresses any kind of emotional response. Later, it turns out that Bjarne's older brother is in fact the only person that Bjarne has contact with, apart from the nursing home staff and the shop assistant in the kiosk where he buys cigarettes. So the conversation, I would argue, invites involvement in the lived lives of others. Each relates to knitting as something that concerns their own existence. For Sonja as a diffuse lack, for Erna as a longing for relationships, and for Bjarne as a reminder of the only personal relationship he has in his life. In the following sessions, Bjarne and Sonja, they actually open up and engage in therapeutic exploration of their family history and their current relational difficulties. This is the first time that Bjarne talks about himself to anyone during the 8-month stay at the castle. So the staff who are around him, they have never heard any of his family story. And for Sonja, it's the first time she talks to another resident. I remember when Bjarne first opened up and I was walking her back to her apartment, and she suddenly said, who is he? What is the name of him? And I said, his name is Bjarne. And she said, oh, it must be so hard to have lived through that. And so this just beginning of relating to each other, I think, is really, really important for allowing oneself to be in an environment that where you can be vulnerable, where you can be part, where you are not only this old man or old woman. So I think that for socially isolated residents in a nursing home, therapeutic group work on shame and boredom through this heavily facilitated and existentially focused interaction can be helpful. And in any case, I think that it's really important to take shame and boredom deeply serious. I mean, to be curious, to acknowledge the no and the silence, and not just try to remove it or rescue older people from it, but to sort of be with it. So I think that's important to take this deeply serious, not as something to be overcome by bingo or fun events, but as an existential structuring that we must engage in order to engage isolated residents in nursing home settings. So by being with the no, we're already being together at a deeper level than we are when we sort of, just have some fun event that we imagine might be interesting for someone who's 83 or whatever. Yeah, so that was it. Thank you so much for listening.
Time for questions. Just 1 second for the microphone. So on the front here first.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I had 2 very quick questions. I was the part on boredom was very convincing. The part on shame, I would like for you, if you don't mind, to elaborate a bit further in which parts of the reactions you really saw the shame, because I thought as well with your description of de Beauvoir's vieillesse, it was quite compelling. However, I wasn't able to really see it in the specific empirical context. And then my second question very quickly was about your therapeutic measures, that you stay within the realm of the nursing home logic in a sense, because I was thinking about from an outsider perspective where, in various non-Western cultures, the elderly seem to be more stay within the family context and find these, what Erna said, doing something for someone, they find it within their family context and not necessarily within the nursing home. So I was wondering if in that therapeutic context, something outside of the nursing home logic could also be applied. Thank you very much.
So I think the first question is a really difficult one. So is this even an example of shame, or are we, Simone de Beauvoir and me, projecting shame onto a situation which is not at all about shame? I think that is an important question to ask, where I sort of the reason I immediately found Beauvoir's analysis to be helpful was to solve my puzzlement with, first of all, the silence and the withdrawal. So why in a room full of people that could be relating to each other, why is everyone sitting like this? That to me was puzzling, and I think shame could be the answer. And I really strongly emphasize that I don't know for sure. Then also this tendency to really distance themselves from this this stereotype picture of an old person. So there seemed to be something, if not shameful, then at least deeply unwanted in identifying with being old or being in need of care. So again, it's not clear that this is shame, but I think that even the possibility that shame could be a widely an emotion that pervades life in a nursing home, even the possibility that it could be the case, I think forces us to think of how we can facilitate interaction that goes beyond shame. Yeah. And the other question was, could one work with bringing in ideas from outside of the nursing home? I did that actually in another project with elderly nursing home residents, which was more narratively focused. So this was about sharing life stories. And there was actually, I think, also a lot of therapeutic potential in that approach. However, with these residents, in this example, I think they were so reluctant to talk and to share that that would have to grow out, that one would first have to facilitate this idea that we can even begin to talk about our history and our lives. So in the fourth session, both Sonja and Bjarne went back to their childhood environment, and it described how it was for them, and could compare a little bit what differences and similarities, but that took a while for that to be sort of accessible. Yeah.
Okay, Emily. The first question which I had is on methodological question. One is like, why did you choose focus group discussion? And how long you were there? Because the way the conversation you had with the participants here, I think the ethnographic work would have given much more kind of an insight, I feel. But yeah, I mean, this is one of the question. And the second is with the follow-up on what recently the question was on the shame which they had. Was it like the belongingness to the family, or like the one who love? It's like the idea of people, it's like my family left me away into the nursing home, and then me coming from a different context and having seen both in Switzerland and the elderly care homes. It's the silence, but it's because also the people, the way they feel connected to the self and other, the relationship, that is like completely. Is it the reason why they feel ashamed that the people who they love, they left them there? I mean, I'm just curious. I mean, is there a component there? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so the first question was methodology, and that was purely egoistic reasons. I was not there to study shame and boredom at all. I was there to learn existential therapy. And I thought, if I wanted to learn about death and loneliness and how to deal with that, which is so central to existential psychology, then who else to turn to than these really old people in a nursing home? So I didn't have, I mean, this is a methodology by chance. And it wasn't focus groups. It was, the idea was to work therapeutically with whatever existential issues might arise in that setting. So so hence the methodology that I just stumbled in, and probably one could, I mean, if the intention had been to look at shame and boredom, definitely there are better ways. So, and then the other question of why did they feel ashamed? We didn't, well, Bjarne came to articulate not shame, but embarrassment, pervading feelings of embarrassment that grew out of his felt inability to say anything at all. So he was very embarrassed by his own silence. But apart from that analysis that he made on embarrassment, none of them actually talked about shame. And my intuition is that when we grow old, when we are so dependent on others' care, when our loved ones talk to us in this way that I do with my uncle, where I say, "You're looking great today," then sort of our whole physical existence is gazed upon, or there's this felt gaze on this being old, that is a truth about myself that I don't want, but that I somehow, it's a truth that is this truth that I also am. So I think that it's not a shame about something in particular, but it's just shameful in the cultural setting that we have, where old age is sort of most defined deprivatively. So old age is no longer being able to work, no longer having reproductive abilities, no longer having the physicality, no longer looking great like maybe we did once. So when old age is this deprivative category, it's also an empty category. And I think that then that in and by itself is shame-inducing. But again, yeah, I don't know. That more studies would be needed.
Thank you, Emily, for this important research for a group that doesn't say much themselves and need to be heard. But I'm thinking, based on what you present from the data, and of course, this is only a fraction of all the transcription you probably have, I can't help thinking it's like the experience, I mean, the loss of agency is all over the place, both in the way to talk about the others. I mean, they are more stupid than I am, or they can't say, but I am still, but it's sort of in between the lines that maybe they are not. I mean, maybe they're like them. And the knitting is only something if it is for someone. It needs a purpose or something. And we don't even know if she can knit anymore based on what you say. And another aspect that you did not touch on is they are probably also at the elderly home because they're not able to shower themselves. So taking care of your everyday, sort of taking care of your body is not a personal issue anymore. You've lost that part of your agency as well. So I'm a little bit sort of, you know, you asked about the shame, why you don't, I mean, for me, it's sort of, doesn't it connect, or did you talk to them about all these kind of daily, everyday activities that they now can't take care of themselves, how this loss of agency, how, I mean, try to look into that, and that might be a way of linking it to discussion of shame. So yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that is a really great point, and you say it so clearly, this loss of agency. So thank you very much for that. I mean, I think it would take more than 5 sessions to be able to take that issue up in a group setting, because it is such a vulnerable issue. So like, are you able to, oh, sorry.
Yeah, but I mean, of course, I see that you're working with this in a group session where you try to discuss things with them. But I would say as a qualitative researcher, you don't necessarily ask them about how do you feel about loss of agency? You talk about different things, or you maybe do things together with them to get the stories, to get the descriptions, and then identify that here's a loss of agency. So they don't say it here, but it's obvious through all lines. I mean, in between all lines, that there is a loss of agency here. So yeah, so just to say here.
Yeah, so I think you are completely right. And I think that this loss of agency is an interesting aspect that should be explicated. But I also thought you asked whether it was something that I talked about with them. No, okay. So the time I spent with these residents were either the sort of recruitment talks, and then the 5 sessions, and also with some of them walking back and forth because they couldn't find the way to their own apartment. So I think you are exactly right that even in those short interactions, there are abundances of examples of loss of agency. Absolutely, yeah.
So one question here and then one on Zoom.
I wondered why you interpreted Sonia's statement so literally. When I heard it, I immediately understood it to mean that she needed something to do with her hands. And I wondered if there was a loss in translation, but then on the other hand, I may have interpreted it that way because it just made more sense, because people often like to have something to do with their hands, even if it's just fidgeting. So I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, that's sort of, I don't know what you call it, in Kepest, like a hobby horse of mine. I think that clumsiness in therapeutic interventions is extremely helpful. So I think that sometimes it can be better for the client, the patient, the person seeking personal development, that the therapist responds rather clumsily, because it gives them, in a sense, agency or a chance to sort of explicate or realize that this lack of something to hold in my hands is at least not an Easter bunny. So, I mean, here it was intuitive. I won't say it was well thought through that I gave her an Easter bunny, but I think were I to do the whole thing in retrospect, I think that being very clumsy is also a way of being vulnerable as a therapist and inviting common exploration. So I think that a strategy of not guessing what the client is trying to express, but either asking or giving a very clumsy guess is sometimes really helpful. And I think that it is here, I would argue that it is actually helpful here. Yeah.
So we've got a question from Rachel. Thanks, Emily. Really interesting, great work. Can you explain a little bit more about why silence was important in the therapeutic group? I'm thinking about the idea of prevailing silence being a shaming experience for people. How do you think the silence was experienced in the group, and why was this important?
Okay, so very good question. First, I think that the shame in the silence was more experienced by me than by the residents, because they are so used to that silence. I don't think they experience 10 seconds of silence as a long period of silence. So I don't think that that in and by itself was inducing shame. I think that a lot of the time, because there is in the 2 nursing homes I've been working in, there is really heavy silence everywhere, even in the meals, even in other places where there might be conversation. In the therapeutic setting, I think silence is a way of being curious on my part. So silence is a way of waiting for a response. Silence is a way of not running away from the no, in my interpretation. One of the residents, Bjarne, actually explores this issue of silence rather thoroughly in the Danish version of the paper. I've written the paper in Danish, and it will come out in Psyke and Logos. But there I have the transcribed discussion of him exploring silence. And he finds this silence to be embarrassing, not just in the therapeutic setting, but in general in his life in the nursing home. And by being curious about that silence in the therapeutic session, he sort of is able to relate to that silence in a new way, which he himself thinks is helpful. He says, I'm the silent man from Nørrebro. Maybe I should just say that to people, then it doesn't feel so embarrassing. So his this silence, which is something that he suffers, becomes not something that he can overcome, but something that he can kind of identify with, and it can be sort of it can be something that he can live with or express. So he gets some kind of agency over this silence by expressing himself as the silent man from Nørrebro. And I think that that is liberating. And I think that we couldn't have that exploration if we didn't have that heavy silence in the room to talk about, so to say. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you.